All right, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. I have a special episode for you tonight. This is a part three of a series that we started several months back on genealogy. And we did it with my father, who's our family genealogist, and with the expert he leans on very heavily, and that is Sally Cray, who was on that episode and did a great job. It was so large that we ended up having to split it into part one and part two. And we got so much acclaim from that episode. It was really exciting. I knew after that episode, very shortly thereafter, that we were going to have to come back to this topic around DNA research because it was clear to me we had not fully delved into that area. So, how are you doing, Sally?
I'm doing great, Thomas. Doing great.
Welcome back.
Excited about
Really,
tonight.
really glad you rejoined us for this DNA research
Thank
session
you.
tonight. Also with us tonight is a man, David Pope, who my dad has been in touch with for some time now to help him try to get through some of his brick walls on learning about the Pope family and figuring out who we're related to, whether we're related to the Nathaniel Pope line or the Quaker line, all kinds of different things we've been looking at with David. He's been a huge resource for us. He has the original Pope genealogy book, which all of us covet, and he's got the original copy. So, how you doing, David?
I'm good, Thomas. It's so good to be here tonight with y'all. And it's just really an honor to be able to get together and talk about this. It's of interest to a lot of folks. And so hopefully maybe a couple of the people that are watching this podcast will be able to get some takeaways to make their research even better.
Completely agree.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much for joining tonight. And I knew we wanted Sally for this third part, but what I didn't know until I went to your home to visit you with my dad was that you absolutely had to be part of this as well because you have so much good DNA background in terms of research looking at the Pope family. So I knew right away when I talked to you that you had to be part of it as well. So thanks for joining.
Thanks.
All right, so Sally, I'm going to give you a little opportunity here. Just tell us a little about yourself, your background, how you came to genealogy, how you decided to do it full time, and then maybe a little bit about the DNA research you've been doing.
Okay, great. I have been interested in my family history since I was a very little girl. One of my memories was taking flowers to the graveyard and placing flowers at the graves of my ancestors. And we didn't have very many at the cemetery that was local. And so I'd scamper through the graveyard and I'd come back to my mom and say, well, Mom, are we related to these people? Isn't this a beautiful tombstone? And so I think at a very young age, I recognized the what could be beautiful in a cemetery. So branching off to that years later, my parents had both just had passed away, and I really didn't have a lot of knowledge beyond them because I'm from a very, very small family. My father was an only child, and my mother had one sister. So my genetic gene pool of living people was very, very small. And so, with my mother in law's encouragement, I delved further into my ancestry, became addicted to finding my ancestors, the stories behind them, and then looking at the DNA when it became available. I knew that I wasn't going to have close matches, but I would be able to place those more distant matches more accurately in a tree because they were not anything that was going to get confused with the current, more recent ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
So it was almost like a crash course when I started looking at my DNA matches that I knew my second and third cousins were going to go directly into my tree and I could branch it out fairly quickly because if you want to visualize it, the tree trunk was pretty narrow. And I knew the branches were going to be there, and we could fill those in with the second, third, and fourth cousins. So that was kind of a cheat sheet for me. Um, DNA has been a fascinating journey, not only for myself, but for some of my clients. I believe I spoke last time about a friend of mine that had been abandoned in a car right after he was born. And after 50 years of not knowing why he was abandoned or who abandoned him, we were able to find both his mother and his father. And he ended up having a half brother out of the deal. So whether or not you find someone, you still have your answers. And one thing I want to remind people about tonight with DNA is if you do your DNA test and you don't have any of those matches that you're desperately looking for, whether it may be a child that you gave up for adoption or a child that you might think you fathered and was placed for adoption, or if you're looking for brothers, sisters, parents, etc., you might be the first test in the database, but know that you're going to be the first match that they receive when they get there. Someone has to take the DNA test first for there to be a match tomorrow. And so don't feel disappointed when you take your DNA test and get your answers, because they aren't always instant. Hopefully they are. And maybe your DNA test is going to be that instant answer for someone else.
That's a really good point. It's almost like your civic duty, right? I mean, you almost have to put your DNA into the tree and into the database so that you can kind of contribute, especially to your
Right.
family history, right?
Right.
So I have a question for you, Sally. Have you seen DNA be more ruling people into your tree or ruling people out? Which one is it more of a useful tool for?
Um, I think it's clarifying those answers. So it all depends on the case that I'm working on. And in your case with your Pope family, I took your father's DNA matches and built a fairly substantial tree just based on the DNA matches.
Hmm.
So we know which Pope line you guys descend from, the Norford line, the McBride line, all those affiliated families that we have the source documents for and the records, we can confirm through DNA. There were some matches in his DNA that don't have trees that match and mirror what you guys have. So my thought with some of those folks, the way they place in the tree where I believe they go, is that they've had a non-paternal or maternal event. So where they have been, one of their ancestors has been told that they are the child of two individuals. They may not necessarily have been the child of those two individuals. So it's very fascinating to know that it's not a common day occurrence, and it's not the last century. It's been millennials since we've had moms and dads not necessarily raising the children that they created. And so DNA kind of accentuates and clarifies those stories for everyone.
So it could potentially rule in or rule out. Just depends on your situation, potentially.
Exactly. But it does give you the truth.
That's fascinating. Let's go over to David. David, tell us a little about your background and where you come from and how you got involved in the whole DNA and genealogy space.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. So I grew up in North Carolina in Union County, which if folks know where Charlotte is, it's fairly close to that. Um, and as a kid, I always liked history. And so to me, hearing stories about history and what had occurred was important. But then the genealogy aspect of it was not only just the history, but what was my family's part in the history. And so that was very endearing to me. And so, I tell folks I like old things. In a way, having a 1750s era chair in my living room is a little like time traveling when you think about the hands that made that and the people that sat in it. And so to me, genealogy, family history research is an outgrowth of that. And then the DNA component of it, which is so interesting to me, is even more so because we're not talking about just what these other folks did. But when we talk about DNA, and I know we'll get into this a little bit later, you're talking literally about the segments of DNA that 100 years ago, 200 years, 500 years, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, these same sections of DNA that are now in us were part of somebody else's body. Like literally your ancestors, parts of your ancestors are in you, in the DNA, and that's what makes us us. So, to me, it really is as close to time travel as possible when you think about the stories and how we got here. And there's an element of mystery. I mean, most folks like mystery stories. Who done it? How did it happen? And there's a lot of elation when you do find those answers that you were trying to search for. They don't come very often, but when they do, boy, they feel good. So that really, I've been doing this. I'm an amateur. I'm not a professional. And honestly, what I've learned about genealogy and particularly DNA testing and genetic genealogy has been a result of me trying to find answers for myself and my own family.
And really, it's been trial and error for you, right? You've
It
kind of
has been,
made
yeah.
the mistakes and done the success. And that's a fascinating way to put it about how 2,000 years ago, we have pieces of their body in ours in terms of DNA. I never really thought of it that way. That's fascinating. Really interesting. So did you know right away when you got that Pope family book that all of us covet so much? Did you know what you have right away?
So yeah, I mean, this is one that the particular book is by a lady named Marie Mimbs, Mimbs, and she had done very extensive research on Pope families. She had recorded her notes in a book, and it was super helpful. I'd seen references to this particular book multiple times, and so when I finally was able to get in touch with her, she's passed away now. But when I was able to get up with her and get that, it was really helpful to have it. There are times when the book is not very easy to follow. It's a bit of work to try to make sure that you're following the different generations. But I can say, her investment and work, and I know it was a labor of love for her, has paid off many ways. Even some of the connections we were able to find with you and your father, were things that I think were reinforced through the research she had done. So, to me, Thomas and Sally, that's one of the things that, you mentioned it earlier. It really is a little like setting a beacon out in a deserted area and having faith that people are going to come in the future and they're going to find that beacon and it's going to help lead them to something they need to know. And so, just like Sally said with the DNA testing, when I did my first DNA testing and got the results, it really didn't tell me much. It raised more questions than gave me answers. But over time, as we've developed that and more people have tested, the picture develops, and so you're able to make sense. But it takes individual folks. And then I think the final thing, on the topic, I would say is most of us have dealt with a county where there was a courthouse fire and there aren't access to the records that you really would love to have. But every time somebody passes away, particularly with the autosomal testing that we're going to talk about, then there's DNA that's lost that may not be passed down to descendants, may not be passed from their ancestors. And so if you think about it, there is some element of obligation for those of us that do this work to try to help everybody in the future, even if it may not directly benefit us now.
Completely agree. Like I said, and Sally was saying this, it's really your civic duty in some ways. So I have a question for you. When my dad reached out to you, he was incredibly excited. He called me that night and he said, I just talked to a guy named David Pope in North Carolina, and I think he may be the missing piece to us finding out if we're from Nathaniel or William. And so he called me all excited. And what he talks about genealogy and about DNA research, but especially genealogy, he used to be a crossword puzzle guy. And he has completely given it up the last 5 years because this to him is the ultimate crossword puzzle. I mean, this is the puzzle of life. Do you guys both agree with that? I mean, does it feel kind of like a puzzle to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is a puzzle, it's a mystery, and it's every time you find a new source document, a new record, you feel that it's going to connect two of those pieces that you may have already had. And I think DNA, when you talk about burnt courthouses and the loss of records, maybe we can view DNA as kind of bridging us over that 1890 census
Yeah.
that was totally lost. And so if we can get those matches from the 1900s to the 1880s, then we've we've really crossed a hurdle, kind of broken through that brick wall that a lot of our traditional genealogists weren't able to before they had the DNA.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating and strong tool that we have now.
So one of the things, David, that Sally cautioned my dad about, and we talked about it on the first podcast, was that he had a tendency to get all excited, and then he would think, this for sure has got to be our line, and he would go put in all kinds of generations into ancestry.com, and then they would do more research and find out later that he had gone down a rabbit hole and had to go pull it all out. And he did that multiple times to the point where it was maddening. And now he's much more careful. He really waits to work with Sally and with other sources he works with to make sure that it's true before he actually puts it in. So have you seen that kind of thing? Have you run into some things where you thought you had verified something, but it was not true?
Oh, absolutely. And the funny thing is that, again, the DNA is a great help. Now, this isn't on my paternal line, but on my mom's line, one of the big discoveries was, and this was absolutely conformed with the family tradition, about a great grandfather's father. So my great great grandfather, and my great grandfather was born out of wedlock. There was a lot of suspicion about who the father was. There was this crazy story about the man actually being killed in a fight, when he was drunk, prior to my great grandfather being born. And I can remember coming across some newspaper articles from that time period that lined up with everything. And the crazy thing, and Sally, you'll appreciate this, the man that would have been the father in this case traced back to one of the DAR qualifying ancestors, had been a militia captain in the Revolution. And so I thought, oh, we've found this scoundrel that was my ancestor, that all these stories were told about, and he happened to descend from this very illustrious family that was settled right outside of Charlotte. And then I and this is my mom's side, and so I got my first cousin on mom's side to do DNA testing, and when the results came back, it didn't match anybody with that surname. And so I'm scratching my head, and as Sally has said before, and this is absolutely the case, DNA doesn't lie, but it can be confusing when you try to understand how to make sense of it. And then, much later, from the DNA matching using both the Y DNA and the autosomal DNA, we actually identified the man that was my great great grandfather, that no one in the family had any knowledge of, no connection to. His family had no knowledge of us. And there's a remarkable story there in terms of that particular family. But yeah, that was one where I thought I had solved an 80-year-old mystery when I found these newspaper articles that lined up with the family tradition and gave a name. And then to find out a couple of years later that, even making that discovery, that wasn't right.
Well, and there was a good story that was being passed down, and it may have been elaborated, every Thanksgiving it got a little bit juicier. Yeah. And then when you got to the scene with some DNA, then you found the true story.
Yeah. Well, what was crazy about it, Sally, was the entire family was just mortified. I mean, for us, a couple of generations removed, there's not that emotional connection, right, that may have been there. And so for us, I mean, it was intellectually, a curiosity. Where are we from? And so the family had sort of reconciled themselves to this very sort of, macabre past. I mean, literally, the guy died. There was a court case about it, an inquest and everything. And then for my mom and other members of the family to realize, well, it isn't even that guy. It was some other random man that was his father. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something that, and from my perspective, I thought, why would anybody ever make up such a terrible story about their, everybody wants to believe they're related to George Washington, but nobody would ever make up a story to claim that they're descended from this, this particular circumstance. So
are you saying, David, that we have some colorful people in our tree? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Well, this is on my side. So you may have some that are colorful on your side, but but definitely on my side for sure.
My dad, Sally, loves the researching of the people back in 1100, 1200, because all these guys were in battles all the time, and most of them actually died in battle. And often they would have sons before they died in battle, which was good. But
Hopefully, yes.
the stories about these guys, losing their head, or you're taking the other guy's head first, and it was an incredible time back in the medieval times. And our lives are so boring compared to what they had to face back then. So
Right, right. Well, and when you think about the living conditions back then, whenever I think, oh, it's really cold, or, oh, the air conditioner went out, and I think, okay, it's still not as bad as going out west in a covered wagon
Mhm.
pulled by, a couple mules if I'm lucky. So it, I think our personal history, when we look at what our ancestors have accomplished, any day that we have is a good day, an easy day compared to what they probably went through.
it's true. It's true. So before we get into the material, I wanted to ask both of you guys. I know you've both kind of helped my father through the small mourning period that we weren't part of Nathaniel's line, and we actually were William the Quaker's line. But how did you guys both kind of contribute with him in that process? Because I know that was a big enlightening thing for him.
Well, I think when you look at the records that we were able to find on your family, you have to take those records and, instead of looking at a snippet, so many times then we think we found something fascinating and it's 3 lines at the end of a paragraph on the second page. Well, you need to look at the first page and the last page and take everything into context. And so that was something that your dad, God love him, had taken some things out of context, and those were in other people's trees where he was taking that as a source document. So even with the census records, you need to sometimes look at the next page, because if your family's listed at the bottom of the page, it would have, Thomas Pope with his wife and 3 kids. Well, if you turn the page, he's got 2 more kids. And so you need to look at the whole generation or the whole document when you think you found something really good.
It's a really good point. Yeah. And the other thing we have to be fair about is that he inherited everything from my grandfather, and my grandfather was dealing with, records. There was no ancestry.com. There was no DNA.
Right.
And so he was doing the best he could, driving around courthouse to courthouse around Virginia. And
Well,
so,
and I think no matter which Pope line that you descend from, all of you guys use the exact same given names for
Yeah,
every generation and
yeah,
subsequent generation. And so Jesse Pope is the perfect example. Thomas, your line has Jesse Popes. David, your line has Jesse
yep,
Popes.
yep,
Well, in 2025, Jesse isn't that common of a first name. So
right.
it would not be a hard mistake for any genealogist to make, thinking, oh, I've got the
hmm,
right Jesse Pope, because there couldn't be 8, 9, 12 Jesse Popes.
hmm,
But
good point.
oftentimes back in the 1800s, there were multiple Jessies.
Right.
And you almost have to make a study of different surnames
Yeah.
in some cases to see which family you're in.
And I assume, David, it's not just my dad you've helped connect, but you've probably had lots of popes come to you to help them try to connect to which line they're part of, correct?
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I mean, I go looking for them. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, Thomas. I mean, like you said, it's great to have ancestry and so many folks that are interested and looking, but it is so easy for errors to, not out of malice, but just out of, sort of a lack of understanding, to be propagated, and the same error, and then it shows up in 40 trees, and people think, well, it's out there 40 times, it has to be true. So no, I
Mm.
mean, I've done a fair amount in terms of, um, starting from where I am and trying to work back, but then also finding folks that I think may be connected, and then working forward from them and trying to find descendants that are living, male line descendants who would be willing to test. Um, Funnily enough, Ancestry.com and Facebook, I've found those two are good tools, because I can find usually some descendants that are still living through official documents, and then I may be able to find those folks on Facebook. And often I will send a message, explain what I'm doing, and maybe 1 out of 3 times somebody gets back in touch with you. I've got, and I know we've got it referenced at the end of the slide deck, but I created a small page on Facebook for folks that are interested that may be looking as a way, sort of a landing site to try to make these connections. And what I have found is that a lot of folks that have an interest in this, although it may not be their hobby, that they tend to go out of their way to be nice and try to participate and share information. So it's a very, I think, generous group of folks that are doing this work.
So, David, I know Sally took the plunge to do this full time. Have you ever thought about it? Have you ever thought about taking this hobby that takes so much of your time and turn it into a profession?
It's something that maybe after I retire, I could see myself doing. Honestly, I don't know that I'm as good at it as I would need to be to do it for a living. And I guess maybe, in the back of my mind too, I've thought if this went from being something I do to fun to something I have to do every day, then it might not still be fun. It might be, I don't know. But I'm sort of settled in with the job and the calling that I've got now and a family. And so
Sure.
I've got at least, about another 10 or 15 years before I can think about that.
Well,
Well,
maybe Sally will hire us in about 10 years. Never know.
well, I will say two things on that. Um, you know, when you get to retire, David, and you find that there are more than just the Pope mysteries to work on,
Mhm.
then you don't get so stuck in one rabbit hole. There's
Mhm.
always more mysteries along the way.
That's a good point.
And that my other point is if anybody out there is watching and they're like, well, David's got a really cool site here on Facebook, but it's only about the popes. You know, there are just about every surname possible doing the exact same
Yeah.
thing that you guys are doing with the Pope family.
Mhm.
So if you're interested, do a smidge of research. You'll find a group that's
Yeah.
specifically looking for your surname
Right.
and see if you can't be part of that experiment and helping your ancestors or the people with the same surname as your ancestors look farther back into history with them.
That's a great point, Sally. I mean, right now with the sort of research we're doing, here's what is ideal. What is ideal is if I have somebody that's interested that has done painstaking research, well documented from themselves back to whoever their earliest documented ancestor is. And it doesn't have to be far. I mean, it literally could be their great grandfather or great great grandfather. But knowing that is absolutely rock solid, and then being willing to DNA test, at least in the work we're doing on the popes, those two things, that is a great foundation. And very quickly we can make some pretty big jumps
Mhm.
based on the DNA. And then the other work, like you were describing, Sally, you get far enough back on the trunk, and then you get into these branches where the work's already been done in a lot of cases.
Yes.
But if you don't have that rock solid foundation where it's absolutely proved, then you're starting again from scratch.
Right. Or you're going down the wrong,
Mhm.
you're going off a branch that doesn't belong on the tree. So the strong, solidly research line is critical for the success. Hmm.
Well, everybody listening tonight, you heard Sally, you heard David. It's your civic duty. Go get DNA tested, and you'll find out at the end of this program that you'll really want to do that anyway for your family benefit. So, you guys ready to get into this material?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Let's dive in. All right, so we're calling this Building Your Family History Part 3. This is through DNA research with Sally Cray and David Pope. Again, thank you guys so much for coming tonight. I can't tell you what an honor it is.
Thank you.
Talking about genealogy, this is a word that comes from ancient Greek, genealogia, the making of a pedigree or the study of families, family history, and tracing of their lineages. And Sally, you can attest to this, being a professional genealogist, that you use all kinds of methods to do this: oral interviews,
Absolutely.
historical records. And last episode, if you didn't watch it, please check it out sometime. We went through all the different historical records and types of documents you should be looking for or could be looking for. Genetic analysis through DNA testing, of course, that's our topic for tonight. Websites, other records. You can also do interviews of people in your family or people you think might be in your family. Any comments about the definition of genealogy, just so people understand it?
Well, I would say that the genealogy is something that's going to evolve as your generations evolve. So, not just your personal genealogy, but the genealogy of your aunts and uncles, of your children, your cousins, all of that builds into what we would be looking at, from the past generations. So, we also want to document our current generations so that the next iteration of ancestors has this kind of information easily attainable. We might think that the technology that we have right now is going to make genealogy in the future easy. But if when you think about how much technology has been lost in information when a hard drive dies or that floppy disk doesn't have a
Mhm.
slot to slide into anymore, we could be losing more information than we're actually keeping.
That's true. Have you guys ever seen the TV show where they do DNA testing on the show and they inform the person who's being tested a little bit about their family that they didn't know? Have you seen that show?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Finding your roots,
Yeah.
or
yes, Finding Your Roots.
who do you
And
think you are? All of
there
those.
there've been some unbelievable episodes on there. I've really enjoyed it. And one of them, Barack Obama was on there. It's when he found out he was related to Brad Pitt, and it was a really interesting reaction. So anyway, I just was curious if you guys had seen that show.
Yes, PBS does a fantastic job with that show.
They do.
Anything you'd add to this one, David?
Um, I would reiterate what Sally said. Even if you're not into genealogy, write down your parents' info, your kids' info. Document when things occur in the life of families, like children are adopted, because
Mm-hmm.
time passes quickly. And 3 generations from now, folks may be scratching their heads and saying, wait a minute, why does this child not show up in the 2020 census when they should have been 5 years old? But they show up in the 2030 census and they're 15, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, that's something that Sally makes a great point. Um, going back is where folks usually focus, but the present and going forward and keeping it updated is really important too.
It's a really good point. I used to love, and you said, David, you loved history as a young boy. I used to love interviewing my grandparents, even when I was very young. And I would ask them to tell me old stories about family members, my great grandfather, my great great grandfather. And of course, I wish I had been mature enough to actually take notes and actually write the stuff down. But I used to find that just fascinating, interviewing my grandparents.
Mhm. And that's
Recommend
something that we can do right now is
right now.
interview those people that we still have
That's right.
that can share what their experiences were. Because, back to the census records, it was just a couple years ago when they released the 1940 census, I think it was.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when you think about the 1950, 60, 70 census, or even the 2020 census, 50 years from now,
Hmm.
I don't think there's going to be a release of that information like there has been in the past. So that's why I think it's so critical for us to be documenting what we're doing right now.
And even tape record people. If there's somebody who's in
Right.
your life who's a grandparent who maybe is
Sure.
very very old, try to tape record their old stories so you got
Yes.
an oral history of it as well. So.
Hmm.
We carry these around, every day, but
Mhm.
yet most of us, myself included, haven't sat down and interviewed my parents and got them
Mhm.
on video. The
Mhm.
other point that to back up what Sally's saying, What has changed about our culture and society is people are a lot more mobile now than they used
Mhm.
to. So,
Absolutely.
the research we're doing in the 19th century, usually if a family's in a county, it will stay in that county for several generations. But I
Mhm.
think about
Oftentimes.
my own experience, and basically every 10 years, my wife and I and our family is in a different place because we're
Mhm.
moving with jobs and
Right.
people moving from one state to the next. And so I really think in some ways, even though there's more records, um, understanding the story is going to be harder. So if you don't
I
sit down
agree.
and write out, Thomas, hearing your dad's story about his family and
Mhm.
how they moved and where they went and what the connections were,
Mhm.
a couple generations, it wouldn't make sense if that story isn't recorded.
That's true. And it's
Right.
good news that he's actually recorded so much of it himself, notes and everything else. So I'll inherit all of that one day, and I'm going to try to do the same. Make sure that we're always recording. So, yeah. Well, let's take a look at DNA testing. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes for a total of 46. This was a slide, David, you inserted here. Anything you want to comment here right away about DNA testing in general?
Um, no, and Sally, please, weigh in as well. Um, I do think, and we'll talk about this more, but when we think about the types of testing that are out there, big distinction between 22 pairs of the chromosomes
Mm-hmm.
that we consider autosomal DNA that is inherited relatively equally from your ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Y chromosome, which only men have, and the testing for that will give the direct line back on the father's father's father side. And then finally, the mitochondrial DNA is very interesting. So, a mitochondria is a structure that's inside a cell and it has its own DNA. And because that mitochondria is passed in the egg of a woman when she has a child and then it's fertilized, all of us, every human has mitochondria that comes from their mother, not from their dad, even guys like me. And so that's a way on the direct maternal line you can see what the connection is.
That's a good point. Anything, Sally, here for a comment?
Well, if we're starting to lose anybody because it's getting to be too scientific, don't worry. You don't have to, there won't be a pop quiz on this slide because your DNA tests are going to take care of all of this science for you. So don't feel that you have to figure out all of your different chromosomes and know what to do with them. These companies will take care of that for you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I do like this picture here on the right side to really explain, what the 46 total chromosomes that are in your DNA. In terms of autosomal and mitochondrial, you mentioned what those are, David, but what about Y chromosome testing? How is that different?
Yeah, so the Y chromosome is passed from father to son. It's only a test that's available for men to do. Although women that are interested in this particular line of descent could have a brother or a paternal cousin test, or maybe an uncle. What's interesting to me about the Y chromosome is, and again, it's a little scientific-y, but the Y chromosome is much smaller than the X. And so
Mhm.
men have a Y chromosome and an X chromosome. Because it's so much smaller, it doesn't mix or recombine in between generations. So
Mhm.
really, Y chromosomes are passed virtually unchanged from father to son all the way down. And so the Y chromosome allows us to look thousands of years back into history, to see what the connections are that even predate the use of surnames. So you can get, DNA results that are helpful, Thomas, for figuring out, is your Pope family and my Pope family connected?
Right, right.
But it also can tell us things about, the movements of huge numbers of people over time throughout Europe, throughout Africa. And so to me, that's really pretty fascinating.
Is this why DNA research has always been kind of male centric over the years? I know it's become much more
Yeah, I
both
mean,
sexes now, but it seems like it's been much more male centric over the years.
It is. So, I mean, the thing, to think about why testing is this. In Western European cultures, typically the surname that a family or a person carries is derived from their father.
Right.
Not always the case, and more recently, maybe that isn't as common as before. But in a lot of cases, the Y chromosome and the family surname are tracking throughout time. And
Makes sense.
we'll talk, Sally's already mentioned non-paternity events. We'll talk about
Right.
that.
Right.
But in most cases, if you're tracking the surname line, the Y DNA is going to be the marker of that to be very helpful.
Very good point. Are there any other DNA tests outside of these three? I know these are the three principal types, but are there other ones that they're experimenting with or looking at?
There is some whole genome testing. It is not very common. It's fairly expensive, and it often is used more for health implications.
Mhm.
I mean, theoretically, there would be good genetic genealogy uses for it, but most of the utility is in these tests. And the vast majority of testing that's done in the US, and frankly the world, is autosomal DNA.
Right.
So
Autosomal
that,
definitely being the most popular, right? For sure. So, question for you guys. I know some couples who are prospective parents get some DNA testing done, sometimes trying to identify if they might have, maybe some kind of birth defects they have to think about or in their possible downlines. Have you guys seen stuff like that before?
Um, that's not going to come across in any of the genealogy DNA tests. That's
Right.
going to be through your medical facilities that will
Right.
help them with that result. So any kind of autosomal Y or mtDNA test would not give you the results that you would want in those cases for those parents trying to make sure that they're genetically um, predisposed to any kind of issue that they'd want to possibly address.
So those really are different tests completely.
yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Although there, it's kind of a similar concept, right? You're going to go get tested. They're going to try to determine if you have a predisposition for Down syndrome or something like that.
Yeah.
For your,
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, the
And
difference would be they're looking for specific mutations, but like Sally is saying, that's something you'd go through a healthcare provider to get. That's
right.
not
Right.
something in this realm. And
Gotcha.
quite honestly, even some of the autosomal testing companies that offer, traits or, are you a super smeller, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think the science is really good on that right now.
Okay.
So I would probably steer clear of that as well.
So most of the companies you guys are going to be talking about tonight have all three of these types of tests, typically.
actually, no, only FTDNA has the Y and the mtDNA testing.
Okay.
So the other companies that we discuss will have the autosomal, which cover both your paternal sides,
Gotcha.
paternal and maternal side.
Gotcha. Well, let's talk about how DNA is measured. It's this measurement called the centimorgans or CMs. And you
Mhm.
can see, Sally, you put in a pretty nice chart here of how you measure CMs, parents and children, all the way down to grandparents. So maybe
Right.
you can give us a little background on this.
Well, the higher number of centimorgans that you share with a match uh, reflects the closer the relationship. So when you do any kind of DNA testing, autosomal especially, with your children, they're going to come up between the range of 2376 to 3720. So if you're looking at your DNA matches, you'll be able to see your siblings in there. Possible half siblings are going to be in those ranges, your aunts and uncles, your nieces and nephews, and then your grandparents. So when you think about the number of centimorgans that your DNA matches share with you, that is going to be derived from the proximity they are to you on your tree.
Hmm.
So when you think about your shared ancestors, say your grandparents, so your parents had 50% of each of their parents. So your grandparents would then reflect 25% in your genetic makeup for your
Got it.
centimorgans.
And so
So
would it go
that's how the
down?
numbers kind of decrease down.
Would it go to 12 and a half for the great grandparents and then
Yes.
6 1/4 for the ones beyond that? Okay.
It keeps getting technically divided in half each
Mhm.
generation down.
Got it. Very interesting. Do you
Mhm.
see the CM's measurement in most of the work you do as well, David?
Yes, and so, I know that Sally's got a good slide that'll be coming up, but when you get a match, usually the company will give you a range that they think the person is related, but the more reliable measure is the number of shared centimorgans. And then
Mhm.
you know that within that particular shared amount, there are several different relationships. And so I'll wait till that slide for Sally to explain it. But yeah, I mean, this is what I look at to try to determine really how many generations away are the two people that have tested that match,
Right.
and where would we look to find a common shared ancestor?
And so
Exactly.
like that example you gave of the man, the scoundrel you thought you were related to, but you actually weren't. In the end, when you tested, I guess there was no centimorgans there. It was a 0 or
Yeah,
very
so
low.
there was nobody descended from that family that was a
Okay.
match, but yet the family that we found, and this is something that maybe I should have said earlier, one way to think about the research is not trying to prove who your ancestor was, but really trying to disprove that it
Right.
isn't somebody, right? To
Yep.
take it to the other side. And
Right.
Yep.
so at the point that I really had sort of honed in on who I thought was, then I set up, as Sally's described, sort of a test tree. And then you look at the testing and you try to disprove that it is. And what you find is that if you've got it right, these connections. So, my mother's aunt tested and bam, was right exactly where she should have been for the centimorgans. My
Makes sense.
mom, other cousins, deconflicting different lineages that could have had shared ancestry. So yeah, this
Mhm.
is very helpful.
And one thing that some of my clients will say to me was like, nobody had a DNA test that they could have taken back in 1880.
Right.
So
Mhm.
how do we know that I do or I don't have that person's DNA in my results? And so that's when you have to look at who those people had for ancestors and descendants. And you
Mhm.
want to build your tree back to that area, build their tree up to your area, and see if there's a match or not.
Gotcha.
So if your scoundrel obviously had some records that you could track, and so you could build out a tree based on him. And if none of those people in that tree ever connected with anyone in your tree, then you know that there's no connection to him. And
Right.
Gotcha.
that's when you had to say, well, wrong rabbit hole. I've got
Yeah.
to go down a different rabbit hole to see who my grandfather really was.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Right.
So, without getting too scientific or technical, can you guys explain how these shared chromosomes are measured in terms of centimorgans? Like, how does this technology know? Is it strands of DNA that match, or
It's a unit of measurement.
Right.
okay,
So that's and it's a universal unit of measurement. So it's going to
okay,
be the same amount whether you're on Ancestry or 23andMe. So a centimorgan is that there's nothing else to really compare it to because there's no grams or ounces or anything like that. So consider it something like I guess maybe like a millimeter.
Yeah.
And
or maybe number of strands that actually match each other, or something like that. I'm just trying
well,
to in
it
No,
layman's.
wouldn't be a strand because we're
measure.
talking about segments on one of those strands.
Okay, got it.
I mean, it's literally if you so, and I forget, Sally, what the actual number is, but I think that each person has about it's maybe 5480 centimorgans if you were to look at their DNA, the length of it.
Mhm.
And then it's a question of, okay, of that total amount, then how much length? And again, we're dealing in, even below microscopic. This is
Absolutely.
subnuclear. But how long is the distance that you're sharing? And so that's why, parents and kids, a kid has basically half DNA from one parent, half DNA from the other parent.
Correct.
And so that's why you get these numbers in every generation. As Sally said, the number theoretically splits in half. There's complexities to that she'll talk about later, but
And you
yeah,
see
I mean,
you see the picture there to the right of all the centimorgans, so you can see, like you said, it's just infinitesimal if you look at somebody's total picture. So
Well, it's the exact opposite of the universe. Our minds can't comprehend the universe, but our minds can't necessarily comprehend the specificity in something so small as our
mhm.
DNA.
Got it.
yeah.
Got it. Interesting. Well, let's talk about the three DNA tests and which ones you guys see done the most. So we talked about autosomal, the Y-DNA being the males only, and then the mtDNA. And you mentioned, Sally, there's only one company that does all three. But
Correct.
in terms of the clients that you guys have or the people you work with, what are the tests you see done the most and for what purposes?
I see the autosomal done the most because my clients are usually looking for family and ethnicity. So they aren't necessarily looking only for the the male line. So like with the Y-DNA, that that completely eliminates their maternal grandfather because you can see the light
Mhm,
blue is significantly lighter, so he's not going to show up in
mhm.
that Y-DNA. So it's only going to be that surname that is passed down. So the only man that's going to be represented, excuse me, in the Y-DNA is only the father's fathers.
So the Y-DNA should be a really niche situation or
Absolutely.
niche scenario when you use it. Okay. All right.
And mtDNA is the same way. But it's even a little bit more haphazard when it comes to researching because it's going to be your mother's mother and
Yeah.
her mother and her mother. So where the Y-DNA is going to be hopefully one consistent surname with the multiple spellings and gyrations of the name, the mtDNA is going to give you a variety of surnames that hopefully are in the database that can be tracked down.
Got it.
So with mtDNA, it's even more, almost want to say obscure
Yeah.
because so many times women are not documented.
If
So
you're
when you get back into the 1800s and the 1700s, it's Mary, the wife of, Martha, the wife of. And so when you are looking at some of these mtDNA results, they're those surnames are not
Yeah.
reported anywhere that you can even get into the database.
if you're really serious about doing this research for your family, does it make sense to do all three of them? Would that give you a more accurate picture, or is autosomal usually good enough to do the full picture?
Depending on your goal, I would still say that going with your autosomal DNA, and if your goal is to get the most matches to find out the most family out there, I would say do different companies versus doing a Y-DNA and an mtDNA.
Got it.
Because that specificity in the Y and mtDNA is going to eliminate so many people out of your family tree. Those generations are going to be isolated down to one person each generation, one male and one female, where the autosomal is going to get everyone in each generation.
Got it. What do you think, David?
I, I generally agree with what Sally's saying. Absolutely. I think if you're a very serious amateur hobbyist family historian, what you end up doing, or what I've ended up doing, is you find somebody on these other branches of your tree that are not the direct paternal line. you find somebody else that sort of adopted that particular branch or surname, that family, and link up with them to get their information. So, for example, like in this case, so I'm doing the research and really have sort of narrowed my focus from all the different lines that I could be researching. I've tried to focus on my paternal line because there are other folks that have done good research on other family lines. My mom's side, a couple of generations back. Um, but yeah, most people, I think, the autosomal DNA, it's the least expensive, it's the most widely available.
Hmm.
And there usually are folks that are doing a surname project. So, like with your dad or you, right?
Right.
All it
Right.
takes is to find one or two other folks that are sort of doing this work on the Y DNA, and that can be very helpful. The only other caveat I would say is the mitochondrial DNA has been used in some very specialty circumstances. So if you'll remember a couple of years ago, Richard III, King Richard III, was
Yes.
discovered under a car park. So
Hmm.
the way they were able to use DNA testing to confirm that that was Richard was this mitochondrial DNA. Like the Y DNA, it traces back many, many generations. And in that case, there's always going to be a mother. So one of the problems with Y DNA testing, and I'm a good example of this, if a man doesn't have any sons, then he can't pass on his Y chromosome. So I
I
have
got it.
3 daughters. They're wonderful. I love them very, very much. But I'm what's called, I've daughtered out. So I've got nothing but daughters. So if you want to trace through my line, you actually have to go back to my brother who has sons, right? In terms of future generations. On the
Gotcha.
mitochondrial DNA, because it's always coming through the mother, there are more lines to look if you're doing really, really deep historic DNA testing.
Well, I know your wife doesn't want to hear this, David, but it's never too late.
Yeah, she won't want to hear that.
Yes, you won't. I know. But it's interesting. So you're saying, like I said before, there really are cases and scenarios where these two other tests would be really helpful and could really like crack a case.
I
Okay.
think of them as specialty tools.
Yeah.
And
They're
so, generalist versus specialist tools.
Gotcha.
good way to
Gotcha.
put it.
Interesting. So looking at autosomal, uh, this is something you put in here, Sally, about how it really generates a large number of DNA matches for both males and females.
Mhm.
So any additional content here?
Well, I think this visual really gives you a good idea of the small bit of DNA that you get from each one of your ancestors. So you're going to get 50% from your parents, but then they receive 25%, and so on and so forth. And so you get back to that fourth great grandparent, they're still going to be represented. It's going to be a small bit, but they're still represented there. And so far back, they're still going to be represented. That's just infinitesimally smaller each generation. And what's truly fascinating is when you do look at your DNA matches, you can look at those small numbers of centimorgans shared and know that you'd be able to find those people where they descend from the exact same person based
Yeah,
on those tiny little slivers of color back in the fourth great grandparent realm.
that's amazing. Wow.
So it really it works magic.
It does.
There's really no other words to say it because wherever they were, that was your ancestor, and you can track yourself to them.
You had an interesting note here. Furthest degree of relationship on this chart would be the sixth cousin or further level. So what does that mean exactly?
That means that when it gets farther back than your sixth cousin or more, that's when those tiny little percentages are getting so tiny that currently we can't say with much certainty that we would be able to confirm that those are truly your ancestors.
So if you wanted to go further back than that, would it essentially be DNA testing is not going to support that research anymore, and now you have to go to records.
Well, if the records exist.
Right.
One of the things that gets complicated, Thomas, is so about 5 to 6 generations back, you basically, we talked about centimorgans and how much DNA there is, and there's a certain small size beyond which the DNA doesn't tend to separate in halves again in terms of what's passed. So, once you get 5 or 6 generations back, in essence, what's occurring is the DNA is either choosing this tiny bit or this tiny bit. And so if it chooses this tiny bit, then even though this person's, the person the DNA comes from is your ancestor, then you start to lose the proof in the DNA that they were. So
Gotcha.
it absolutely is true that all the DNA we have in us at that small sort of unit level is DNA that's been passed to us from thousands and thousands of years ago. The utility with the autosomal DNA is beyond the 5th or 6th generation, round about that, it's hard to be able to tie the DNA, as Sally's saying, back to an individual family.
Got it.
That's where, for example, the Y DNA, if you were looking on that particular line, the Y DNA goes back because there's not this halving every generation.
Got it.
You can go back farther. Same thing with mitochondrial.
That makes sense. That actually makes sense. And so when my dad's talking about generation 30, Sally, clearly the last 24 generations, he wouldn't be able to tie it to a DNA test.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. Gotcha. Makes sense. So what about the mtDNA testing? You said this is only offered by Family Tree.
Yes, only Family Tree DNA offers this test at this time. And it's really, again, going to be those mother's mother. So again, like we said, it's going to be very specific, and it's going to not represent anyone else except that maternal line. So perfect example was poor guy that he was buried by a tree, or he was left by a tree, and then eventually we covered it up with a parking lot. So they start, repairing the parking lot, and we find a king of England. Who knew?
Right.
But
Exactly.
thank goodness for the mtDNA testing that they could use to clearly identify who he was and rewrite history with DNA. Pretty
Under
fascinating.
under a parking lot.
Under a parking lot.
It's amazing. Yeah. This is fascinating. Any other examples you guys can think of other than the king under the parking lot that we would use this for, or any other scenario?
Again, if you're looking for your mother's line,
Mhm.
and really isolating down which line married into your family, it becomes a very specific situation when you're looking at your mtDNA or your Y DNA.
Got it. Interesting. So looking at Y-DNA, just the flip occurrence, you guys talked about this earlier. Any situations come to mind that you can think of where this cracked a case or helped with some brick walls?
Sally mentioned it before, but particularly for recent paternity that's unknown, this is often, this along with the autosomal DNA testing used in tandem, this is definitive. So, I know of, 3 or 4 cases where someone was able to identify their father or their grandfather. I know of a case just from some folks I'm connected with that do this sort of work, where a woman in Germany who was the daughter of an American GI during World War II. And it was through this sort of hobby DNA genetic genealogy testing that she was able to find a whole family of folks in Sampson County, North Carolina, that she is related to, cousins and aunts and uncles, or first cousins, second cousins. And it's been through this.
That's fascinating. So, in terms of the test that they would give in a court for paternity or custody cases, do you know what kind of test that would be to try to prove who the father was?
That's a little like the question about the medical testing. I don't know what the court accepted standard is. I would tell you the science here is very, it's the science is absolutely solid. There's been cold cases with criminal investigations that have used databases with ancestry DNA or family tree DNA to be able to solve those, but I don't know what the evidentiary requirement would be and what's accepted.
So that's out of the
I'm not
medical.
sure what
It's out of the
the course
medical realm.
uses.
It's out of the medical realm, but it would probably be something similar to this, wouldn't it, Sally? Why DNA?
Well, a DNA test is a DNA test, and
Hmm.
whatever company that the law enforcement uses would be at their discretion. I'm sure that they use a different development bank than any of the standard companies that genealogists use because they would be able to expedite the results of the DNA much quicker than Ancestry or 23andMe.
Hmm. Sure.
One thing I do want to add with the Y-DNA, I had my husband take this test, and what was really fascinating was that as much research on the Cray line that has been accomplished, being spelled Cray, we came across some matches that were Creagh or
Wow.
Craigh.
Wow.
And so it really opened up a lot of avenues that, that you really didn't think about. We knew that the handwriting, the penmanship has always been a problem, and Cray kind of evaporated at one point in the records, but now it's a whole nother avenue to investigate.
So
So
were those his
spelling
Irish and Scottish ancestors, or was that
Scottish.
Scott? Okay. And so they probably came to America and Americanized it, maybe.
Possibly, or the GH wasn't real popular and sometimes when it comes to spelling. So
Hmm.
on the East Coast, they just went phonetically and
Yeah,
said it was a Y.
Hmm.
that's right. Yep.
Interesting.
Nobody was there to spell check. No
Right.
autocorrect.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned in the last podcast, Sally, how, coming through Ellis Island, looking at all those books and doing research and how many things were misspelled. And, a lot of these people were illiterate and didn't know how to write their own name. They would misspell their own name, that kind of thing. So it certainly makes it difficult when you're doing the research.
Yes. Well, much like Pope, a lot of times if you look at family search, sometimes their auto generator has said that it's PAPE instead of POPE.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So when you're searching, you have to kind of open up your mind and look at all the
Yeah.
possibilities that could be there
Hmm.
Yeah.
For sure.
that would be the correct one.
Really, Thomas, my sense is it isn't until the early part of the 20th century, North Carolina around 1913 is when we started doing death records and birth records.
Right. Right.
And so, even taking illiteracy as a given for a lot of the folks I'm descended from, the notion that there was a correct spelling of your name because it was the spelling used in the official government record, like that's a pretty new concept, right? I mean, I think
Right.
prior to that, most folks knew the name was this associated sound that I'm making, right? So one of my ancestors on mom's side, the last name is Walkup,
Hmm.
which is a Lowland Scots name. But there's about 100 different ways to try to write that name
Mhm.
based on what the sound is like. And so, again, I think you have to sort of, as Sally's saying, you have to go back in time and think, if I'm a Clark writing down these things, I'm writing down letters that to my ear seem to express the sound I'm hearing. But it's really the sound of the name as it's used in speech,
Right.
that is that's definitive. Whereas we think, oh well, I've had people argue with me that if you write MC for Mick and don't put the line under the C, their name is wrong, right? But that's completely backwards. in
Right.
terms of, the way things have been historically.
True. Very true. Well, you said you like puzzles, so there you go.
Absolutely.
50 ways to write the name. So,
Yeah.
David, have you ever tried to connect your line to Alexander Pope, the famous writer?
Yeah. So, yeah, I think, there's always a fascination with, historic figures in time. There's a particular family of popes that were granted an Irish earldom, and so those show up. I don't believe that Alexander Pope had any descendants. So a little like George Washington, there's
Right.
not anybody directly related to him.
Right.
And what I found is so this would be one piece of advice I would hope folks would take away. Fight the urge to try to connect to somebody famous. That will almost certainly lead you down the wrong road.
No
Like,
question. No
your
question.
tendency to try to get back to that famous associated person is probably going to do you wrong.
Absolutely. All the articles I read, and Sally, you confirm this, is the amateur genealogist typically does that. And what they'll do is they'll look through the line, and there's three choices, and they choose the one of the royal line. Oh, we must be royal. We must have been the dukes and the duchesses.
Yeah.
And so they
Well,
go with that line, and then obviously later on they find out that's not correct. That was not their line.
and if you really want to be a descendant of Alexander Pope, you need to recognize the fact that he doesn't have any known descendants.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So placing him as your ancestor would not be accurate anyway, unless you had DNA that absolutely positively made you a descendant of one of his illegitimate children, if there were any. But that's a
Or,
couple big ifs.
or you connect yourself right to one of his brothers or sisters, somebody at his generation, something like that. So looking at testing procedures, these are the big four companies out there. I know there's others, but what have you guys typically found with working with each of these four companies? What are your recommendations in working with these to do your DNA testing for your family?
David, do you want to dive in?
Sure. So I've worked most often with Ancestry and with Family Tree DNA. You may hear us have said FTDNA, Family Tree DNA,
Right.
FTDNA.
Right.
Same. And so Ancestry has the biggest database that is very helpful when what you're looking for are matches. And so Ancestry for autosomal testing is a good place to start. Several of these companies allow you to take, and this is a little technical, but if you've got folks helping you with this, they'd be able to help you do it. You can take the actual raw data from Ancestry DNA and upload it to other companies. Like you can take Ancestry raw DNA for autosomal test results and upload it to Family Tree DNA and get the benefit of their database.
I see.
You're not able to go the other way. So what I often do if funding is not a problem, testing Y-DNA with Family Tree DNA and then autosomal DNA with Ancestry, if they're willing to do different test kits.
Got it.
That to me is sort of the gold standard. And that's who I've worked with the most.
And then do you load the ancestry results into FTDNA as well, just so you have it in both places?
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. And then
We like to call that swimming in all the pools.
Exactly. You got to make
Because
sure all the
you
databases.
you really want to put your DNA everywhere that you possibly can to maximize the results of that test.
Yeah.
And when you say Ancestry has the largest database, they have over 19 billion tests in their site right now. So the closest next closest is 23andMe with 14 million. So we're talking 19 billion to 14 million.
Wow.
So that's the pond that you want to put your DNA in.
Yeah.
That's the database that's going to give you the highest chances for DNA matches.
So both of you, if your clients or people you're working with come to you and ask you which one to do, you say Ancestry purely because of the database size.
Yes. And wait until a holiday, Mother's Day, Father's Day, or Christmas, because that's when Ancestry will go on sale.
Yeah.
Got it.
Sally said this before when we talked, but don't ever pay full price for a DNA test. There are
Yes.
regular sales that occur. Take advantage of those.
Yes.
What is the average test for an autosomal first-time test with Ancestry?
I want to
What-
say that full price has ranged anywhere from 99 to 129,
okay,
but usually around Christmas time, Mother's Day, Father's Day, it drops down to 59 or 69.
Yeah.
okay, very good. That just gives people a good range to think about.
Right.
This,
And what I would tell you too, Thomas, is, for folks that are doing this research as a hobby, um, there are often folks that are willing to be able to help subsidize the cost of these tests. If there's a surname research group, so we've got that, and so for folks that don't have, just their willingness to test is sometimes enough to be able to get things moving. Now, obviously, if somebody were to come to Sally as an individual client, it would be different. But if you've got somebody that's been working on something for 10 years,
right,
and this is a key piece of information that we think is going to help answer it, then I don't play golf, and so I've got to have something that I waste money on, and it sometimes tends to be genealogy.
Well,
absolutely,
and that really drives home the point that you need to look and see what kind of groups that your family and your DNA would be valuable to,
Mhm.
because they may pay for your test just to get your DNA into their research pool.
So,
There's value to it.
Absolutely. And by the way, take David's advice and go to Sally and become one of her clients
mhm,
because she'll do a great job for you, like she has for us. So that's my plug.
right.
So my question to you: the cheek scraping procedure, is that the only way to do it, or I've always heard about provide a couple pieces of hair or like
Oh,
what?
Ancestry and 23andMe family tree, it's basically a little spit cup. So the most you have to do is get some saliva into the spit tube, and
Hmm.
you want to make sure that it's not diluted with water or coffee.
Hmm.
So if you have a hard time, some folks try to get their grandparents to do it, and if they cannot get enough saliva to spit in the tube, that can be a problem. But they're spit tests.
Okay,
The
got it.
only test that I've ever done that was a cheek scraping was for my dogs and their DNA testing.
Got it.
So,
So they've gotten it so simple now that all you have to do is spit in a cup. So that's great,
right.
fabulous. So what about reading DNA results? So it can be a little intimidating for the first time DNA person, but what's your
Yes.
advice about when you look at this? What's the best way to try to read it?
Well, again, these numbers are going to be in those centimorgans. And this chart really helps the user understand the range that those centimorgans fall into. At the top right-hand corner is the percentage of DNA that you get from the person labeled in the box. So again, your mother and your father, you're going to get 50%. Grandparents, 25%. Great-great-grandparents is 6.25.
Hmm.
So when you look at your DNA matches, you're going to look at the number of centimorgans that the company states that you share with them. It's going to fall within that range. And then you're going to look at the name that you're going to call that person, the generation that they are. And this helps explain the removed. So, like 1C, 1R, that's first cousin once removed.
Got it. Yep.
Now, using this chart in your DNA makes a lot more sense when you already have a somewhat completed tree of your ancestors. So you're going to know who your parents, grandparents, great grandparents are, but then fill in all of those aunts and uncles, great aunts, great uncles, and all of their children, which are your cousins. So then when you find your DNA matches that descend from your great aunt's family, their first cousin once removed, their second cousin once removed, then you know that your cousin that you share 230 centimorgans with is actually your second cousin first removed, because you can track up where they fall within your tree.
Got it. And you can see there at the sixth generation, both of you talked about how slim it gets. It's 0.0781. So you
Correct.
can see it just gets more and more distant as you go.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see Thomas, like under the 2C, 2R, so second cousin, second removed?
Yes.
Down there, it gives you an average, but the range, so you could have that person as a relative, but you literally could share 0 centimorgans with them. So that's one of those examples where once you get that many generations out, that DNA may not be passing because it's already down to the smallest size packet of information that gets passed down.
Or is it possible you might share a little bit of centimorgans, but they're not picked up by the test, maybe? Is that a possibility?
It could, yeah. I mean, the test results, at least with the companies that I use, they set a lower cutoff. So if it's below, I don't know if it's
I
either
think it's
like
8.
8 centimorgans, then it doesn't show up.
I got it.
The other thing that is probably good to keep in mind is, how we talked about the results will tell you the number of centimorgans shared. So like if the result said 242 centimorgans, there are several places on this chart that could fit. And so that's
I was just going to circle around to
go
that.
ahead, you do it.
Well, because it's that range. So you've got the range of 47 to 760 centimorgans. It's important that you have that family tree created that you can place that person in, and then you'll understand why 246 is the average. They've got 456, but that's still going to be your second cousin because of the range that they fall within and how you know they fit on your tree.
Got it.
This is the bit where, we referenced earlier, the DNA doesn't lie, but you have to be thoughtful about how to interpret it. So this is a case where with autosomal DNA, don't jump to a conclusion that, okay, we share 240 centimorgans. We've got to be first cousins, second removed, right? Twice removed. Like,
Right.
Sally's right. You've got to work that tree and then sort of see how it all makes sense.
And David, you said the first couple times or maybe a couple years you started doing this, it just raised more questions than answers. Is this part of the reason why? Because you didn't know how to interpret it or read it yet?
Well, I mean, the big thing is that until you get enough testers that you've managed to sort of plug into that theoretical tree, you don't know where the connections are. And the other problem too, which is a little bit in the weeds, but if you're from an area where settlement was early and there was not a lot of in-migration to that area, then you are sharing DNA with folks often from different family lines. So you may be related on your father's side and your mother's side to another person because the families have lived there for 300 years and people very close in. And so that can be hard to figure out, okay, how much of the DNA is shared because it's shared on dad's side versus how much is shared on mom's side. And so if you're not thinking that way, it could lead you to think the relationship, let's just say on the paternal side, is a lot closer than it actually is.
Makes sense.
The perfect example of this is your line married, a Pope married a Watson, for example. So you know that you descend from this Pope and Watson union. But Pope had a brother that married one of Watson's sisters.
Right.
So those Pope Watsons are going to be cousins, but their DNA is going to look like they're a closer cousin than they truly are, because those brothers and sisters would have shared the same parents.
It's funny you
So it
mentioned that.
elevates the number of centimorgans.
It's funny you mentioned that because Dad, when he was getting 10 generations back, 15 generations back, he was finding situations where we were double or triple related to that particular ancestor.
Yeah.
And he would spend hours and days trying to find out why. And he often would find out the two different paths we found to that person because of this, very complex situation. So it's interesting. So I am not a math major. I'm okay at math, but I understand every number on this chart. Thank you guys very much, except for one. So the mother, father, 50% makes sense to me. The child, 50% also makes sense. Grandchild, 25% makes sense. But the sibling at 50 doesn't make sense to me. I would think that would be 100 and that your half sibling would be 50. So explain that to me.
Well, your siblings are going to get half from your parents, but they're not going to get the same half you are.
Right.
Oh, okay. I'm with you.
Yeah,
I'm
you have
with
to
you.
think of it as sort of random. So they're getting half of your dad's, but it's not the same half that you're getting. Like
I'm with
Sally
you.
said.
I'm with you. Yep. Okay. Because that was the only number that didn't make sense to me. So then what about if you have identical twins?
That's
They,
a whole nother case study.
yeah,
That'd be 100%, right?
they share 100% DNA.
That's
Yeah.
what I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that'd be the only time you'd have 100 on this chart would be identical
And you
twins.
can appreciate, just to pull that thread a little bit, right? So identical twins, and then they marry. Those two identical twins' children are gonna, on a DNA test, are gonna come back as being siblings
Okay.
or half siblings. I'm sorry.
Half siblings.
Yeah, half siblings. So it can get a little complicated with that.
They had
But
a
that
show.
really drives home the importance of having that family tree to know that John and James were twins. They weren't just brothers, they were twins. And God help us if they both married sisters,
Yeah.
because then their ancestors are going to be even
Mhm.
closer,
Yeah.
or descendants.
But like my nephews, my brother's twin boys are not identical. They're fraternal. And so they would be 50%, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
If they're fraternal twins, then it's the same as if just being a regular sibling.
Makes sense. Yeah. So I saw a show recently. It was very fascinating. They had 7 couples on there that had married each other and they were all twins. So the brothers and sisters had married each other, twins and married twins kind of thing. 7 situations like that all over the country. And they did interviews with these people. So imagine how complicated their family trees are
Absolutely.
with twins marrying twins. So, well, thank you for taking us through that. That's really helpful. So, Sally, tell us
Ah,
about this one.
okay, so your ethnicity that you obtain with your DNA tests, your ethnicity as well as your DNA matches never truly change. But the ethnicity that the companies provide you gets updated based on the information that they store in their database, both from additional DNA matches that are submitted, as well as the records that they use, the data that they use to establish the locality of your ancestry, which therefore drives your ethnicity. So it wasn't until the last update on Ancestry that I became Russian, the large orange area there. So none of my records anywhere show me having any Russian ancestry. So how that comes back into my data and my DNA must be significantly a number of generations back. But at some point, Ancestry believes that I'm now Russian. I do have source documentation and records that take me to my 52% Germanic Europe, my 15% Greece and Albania, 10% England and Northern Europe. What's fascinating now is that Ancestry, while they've given me the huge area of Russia, they've given me the tiny little 3% of Cornwall. So each time that Ancestry is displaying new updates, they are fine tuning your ethnicity estimates.
Do you think that's because other people are putting their tests into the database and it's becoming more fine tuned and more accurate? Or what do you think is the reason? What's your theory?
I think it's becoming more fine-tuned and accurate for a lot of reasons, not just their database with their testing, but also their research into the areas. So it's going to say that there's going to be something in there that they're added to their database that's going to drive my northern Italy. I'm not just Italian, I'm northern Italian. So nothing in their database says that I'm from Sicily or the Italian boot heel.
Interesting.
So it's becoming much more specific in those areas that they say I'm descended from.
And what last name is this, Sally?
My surname, my father's name was Glover.
Glover.
So that was English,
Got
and
it.
that ties perfectly in.
So now you have a couple new targets to go research. You have Russia and you have the Levant of 1%.
Yes, I do. I do. And the subsequent slides really throw a new twist on things, but it does really drive home the point that these maps that these companies give us are not necessarily tied to the regions by the name that we call them today. They tie us to the landmass and the area on that landmass that we had ancestors living at one point.
That's fascinating.
So
Yeah.
don't get tied up with me being Russian. At some point, I had an ancestor that lived somewhere in that area.
So David, what does yours look like if we were to run yours on a map?
Mine is much more boring. So it is English, Scottish, and Welsh, and maybe just a little bit of Germanic. Again, that's consistent though with the settlement patterns in this area where, folks are either Scotch Irish or they're English or they're, Welsh Baptist that moved in.
Interesting. On our side, we had, of course, English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh. We had Dutch. We had Germanic, a little bit of French on my mother's side. And it went all the way down to 1% of a couple countries that were kind of surprising. So, but yeah, mostly from the islands, England, Ireland, Scotland. So very interesting. Well, let's see what this one is here, Sally.
So this is from Ancestry, and what it did was break down the side that Ancestry says that my ethnicity is derived from. So my Cornwall is from my father's side, which would make sense because my mother had more of Mediterranean ancestry. What is truly interesting and a bit troubling to me is that the bright green, which is my Germanic side, it appears that Ancestry just adds the two together, both my mother's and my father's German side, which makes me supposedly even more German. So again, those are ethnicity percentages. So I can't say that that's necessarily right, wrong, or indifferent, but it's interesting to me that it's simply added together.
Well, this is why you're so organized and have to have order all the time.
Maybe.
Maybe so.
Maybe.
So do you think that's correct, or you're not sure if that would be correct if you were to do this?
Well, both of my parents were deceased long before the DNA tests were available to the general public. So I don't have the ability to say, hey, mom and dad, why don't you test for me? So this is the perfect time to say, if you have your mom and dad and your grandparents alive with us, buy them the test full price and get them to test, because you don't want to lose that opportunity.
What's interesting is your mother was much less mixed ethnicity wise than your father was. He had a lot more
Correct.
ethnicity than him.
And what it does make sense, because my father's side was in the States long before my mother's side was. So her ancestors did not come to the States until the late 1800s, where my father's side was here years before.
So if you had the resources, would this chart looking at the one on the left make you want to do either the mtDNA or the y-DNA to try to keep digging in, or?
I would like to do the mtDNA sometime when I have time to
Okay.
really track down where I believe in Germany my maternal side would end up. But
Hmm.
again, that's maternal side. So I
Right.
don't believe that there was a lot of movement in that side. Where it came down to the Greek and Italian side, that would have been on my maternal grandfather. So my connections there are no longer alive either.
But you've always said how exciting it is when you can actually trace it all the way to like a little village in Germany, and you can actually go over and
Absolutely.
visit that little village and think about your, relatives going to the little restaurant there in the center of town. And
Right.
yeah, very exciting.
Mhm.
23andMe. So this is it sounds like this
Yes.
is a smaller database, but tell us about this one.
It's a significantly smaller database, and they cluster the groups of ethnicity and the terminology that we use in modern day today a bit different because now it's Greek and Balkan, British and Irish. I don't know if the British and the Irish like to be lumped together like that. Then the Iranian, Caucasian, Mesopotamian, Arab, Egyptian, and Levantine, those were appearing on Ancestry. And so it's just a different database. It's the same DNA. I haven't changed a bit, but it's how they perceive my ethnicity to be at
And
23andMe,
and no Russian.
and no Russian this time.
Hmm.
Well, I think the large blue area would be what they considered possibly the Russian part.
Maybe
But the
that's
next
the
but the
is that
next slide is no Russian at all. And that's at my heritage.
interesting.
So this really accentuates the more northern European English and Balkan and my Greek and South Italian. All of a sudden, I'm South Italian instead of North Italian. I'm still Italian, but I don't know which end.
So
It's
so for the amateur person out there who, let's say, they just got a wild hair and decided to do all of them,
mhm.
and they're in this confusing situation, what do you recommend for them? How do they determine their family heritage?
I would say don't put all your faith in their ethnicity estimates. It's the region. So when you think about Europe, when we and our ancestors lived in Europe, we didn't stay in the same place all that long. There were wars, there were conflicts, people moved a lot. We oftentimes think that, oh, our ancestors stayed in this little village, for 10 generations. That could be, but 10 generations of some other folks were moving every time, every generation.
Hmm. Okay.
So know that these databases reflect that you had ancestors living there, and you can say with some certainty that your ancestors were there, but it's not 100% accurate to know that you've got someone exactly where they're saying they are.
And this one is interesting. It makes you more English than German, whereas Ancestry had you very heavily German.
Yes.
So that's very interesting.
I think it's important to share that, again, these are estimates, and really what year do you want to say I was only English or I was only German?
Mhm.
What these ethnicity estimates say is that my ancestors lived in this area at some time.
Right. Makes sense. Very fascinating to see the different results you can get. What about
Yes.
family tree?
Family tree DNA, again, I'm not Russian, which is nice. And then my English scale, Wales and Scotland is again a little bit higher. I'm more Poland than anything else. But again, to me, that just means that that area on the map is where my ancestors were from. And today we call that area Poland.
Interesting. And really the Slavs were also very close to Russians as well. So
Right.
your West Slavic might be very connected to that.
And no Italian this time at all.
Hmm. Very interesting.
Mhm.
All right, so Sally, final thoughts. What a fantastic episode talking about DNA and talking about our genealogy and our family histories.
Final thoughts. Don't be afraid to submit your DNA. You can make the results private and understand that if you're looking for somebody, they're not there yet. Sometimes it's really nice to be the first one there for someone else to match to. Um, Not everything's going to be instant. And if you think that you're finding something that might be a shock to a lot of people, make a printout of all your DNA matches, then place your DNA as private so you don't show up for them anymore, and contact somebody, maybe me, and we'll work through those DNA matches and see if there isn't a surprise in your DNA results.
Fantastic advice. Thank you, Sally. David?
So here's my plea. There have been many, many times that I've thought if I could go back in time, I would wring my ancestors' necks for not writing down who their parents were and who their kids were and passing that on generation by generation. But on the flip side, the folks that lived 100 years ago, your grandfather, Thomas, that did all this work, if he knew that there was a test that you could take that was a spit test or cheek swab that would tell you definitively you either are or are not related to Nathaniel Pope, who was a great grandfather of George Washington, he would kick you for not taking that test and answering that question. And so, it's sort of a fair trade-off. So I think we need to be good stewards of the technology and the tools that exist now. And even if you're somebody that is a little into genealogy, but not a whole lot, usually I find that there's one person within a family that is sort of the one that's leading the charge. But
Right.
everybody else is, if they'll write down their information, share what they know, and be willing to participate in the DNA testing, then we can make a lot of headway. And, my hope is, quite honestly, Thomas, by the time that you and I pass away, that a lot of these mysteries that still exist will be solved.
I completely agree. My grandfather, by the way, would have been so excited that this technology exists, but he also, I think, would have been a little frustrated. Why did I spend 35 years driving around to little courthouses in Virginia? But anyway, it was part of the journey. So, well, I cannot thank both of you as so much as participating in tonight. And this has been an incredible, incredible program. I know people are really going to benefit from it. Really, thank you so much, Sally and David.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah,
And and when you guys have a big breakthrough, you'll just have to come back and just tell us all about it.
Will do.
Thank you guys so much for being on Traveling Through History.
Good night.
Have a great night.